Hello again, dear traveler. Tonight, I invite you to settle in once more, deep into your blanket, with the soft sigh of the evening wrapping around you like a faded shawl. The wind outside may hum through the eaves. The clock may tick its way patiently forward. But inside, you are safe. Inside, you are still. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. And let us journey back to a time when the world moved gently. A time when the sharpest sound in a village after dusk was the creak of a shoe bench. And the softest mysteries never quite got solved, only whispered. This is not a tale of grand adventure or frightening twists. It's simply the story of a man. A shoemaker. One who only ever worked when the rest of the village slept, and who, curiously, never once slept indoors. Let us begin. Part 1: The Shoemaker Who Slept Outside. The village of Penlo was not a place that invited attention. It sat, modestly, at the bottom of a shallow hill, between a sleepy bend in the river and a copse of elder trees that leaned inward as if conspiring. The roofs were all of thatch. The roads were more mud than stone. And the chickens often outnumbered the people on market days. But there was one thing, just one, that made Penlo memorable to those who passed through. The shoemaker. Nobody remembered when he'd arrived. He hadn't bought a cottage. He didn't have a shopfront. And he didn't rent a room at the inn, even during the coldest winters. Instead, he worked under the awning of the old granary, which hadn't stored grain in a generation. His workbench was of thick, stained plank balanced across 2 barrels. His tools were worn smooth from use. And his lantern, his lantern, was always lit after sundown, and always snuffed before the first rooster crowed. He never worked during the day. And more peculiarly, he never, not once, slept indoors. Some said he preferred the stars. Others whispered about a promise he'd made long ago, or a curse that bound him to the night air. But if you asked him, which few dared to do, he would simply smile, nod politely, and change the subject to boot soles or polished blends. Children were told to leave him be, not because he was cruel, but because he was strange. He was kind, yes, quiet, always, but strange. And in villages like Penlo, strangeness was kept at arm's length. The shoemaker, whose name may have been Thomas or Henry or perhaps just the shoeman, as the children called him, did his work meticulously. Every pair of boots, slippers, or clogs was hand-stitched, with no two quite the same. It was said that he could tell your temperament just by the way your old shoes creased. But still, no one understood why he insisted on the night, why he stretched his bedding roll next to his bench rather than in a warm loft, even when the frost came early, why he looked up at the moon like it was a clock he trusted more than any bell. That first winter he spent outdoors. Many villagers assumed he was mad or miserly. By the second, they grew accustomed to it. By the third, they forgot to question it entirely. But the woman who ran the apothecary, Miss Etta Woolsey, had her suspicions. And one December evening, when the moon was low and the frost hung like lace on every window pane, she began watching from her upper window. And what she saw that night would not explain the mystery. But it would begin one. Part 2: Etta's Window and the Candle That Never Flickered. Miss Etta Woolsey had a reputation for being the sharpest pair of eyes in Penlo. Not sharp in a cruel way, mind you, more in the manner of a woman who always remembered who'd paid their apothecary bill and who hadn't. She was neat, methodical, and quietly curious, the way some widows are when time grants them fewer distractions and more evenings alone with their thoughts. Her little cottage sat across the square from the old granary where the shoemaker worked. The angle of her attic window offered a perfect view of his workspace, a slanting roof of mossy wood, a battered table, and that odd, constant lantern. Etta had watched many things from that perch over the years: the butcher arguing with the fishmonger, the baker dropping his loaves in the dust, the young lovers who thought themselves unseen under the ivy-covered trellis. But the shoemaker was different. He never shouted, never bargained, never changed. On the evening in question, Etta brewed a mild chamomile blend, her own recipe, of course, with dried apple blossom and a pinch of fennel. She placed the teapot beside the window, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and settled in just after the sun slipped beneath the ridge. It was 6:30 when the lantern sputtered to life, not with the erratic flutter of flint, nor the searching dance of kindling. No, it bloomed instantly, steadily, as if someone had turned up the flame from beneath the world itself. That alone might have been enough to stir her interest. But what held her there was what the flame did not do. It didn't flicker. Not once. The wind outside sighed through the square, rustling the bare branches, jostling the signs that hung above doors. Etta could see smoke trailing sideways from her neighbor's chimney. But the lantern? Steady, as if it lived in a different world. A place without draft or breath. And then, just as he always did, the shoemaker arrived. He did not unlock anything. He did not knock. He simply appeared, stepping out from the dark alley behind the granary like a shadow deciding to walk. He carried nothing but a satchel over his shoulder. Worn and faded, he unrolled his leather apron slowly, methodically, and began to work. The same motions as always: thread, cut, hammer, tap, stitch. But there was a rhythm to it that night Etta had never noticed before, like a lullaby for the hands. It was almost musical, in the way the pounding followed the silence. How the knife sliced just as the crickets chirped. How the soft brushing of soles followed the whistle of the wind. She found herself growing sleepy, her tea cooling at her elbow. And just as her eyes fluttered closed for what she thought was a moment, she woke to find the lantern gone. No snuffing, no darkness creeping in. It had simply vanished. The shoemaker was already asleep. Outside, wrapped in a simple blanket, curled beside his bench, boots lined up at attention as if guarding him in slumber. And Etta, though a woman of firm logic and rooted herbalism, felt a strange pang of something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not confusion, wonder. The kind of wonder that didn't ask for an answer, not yet, but quietly whispered. There's more to this than leather and laces. And in that moment, she decided, she would watch again tomorrow. Part 3: The boots nobody claimed. The morning after Etta's first watch, Penlow stirred in its usual, unremarkable fashion. The baker lit his ovens. The butcher wheeled out his wooden board and washed it with scalding water. Children trailed behind their parents to the well, and the innkeeper's cat attempted to catch a sparrow and failed, again. And the shoemaker? Gone, as he always was. His tools neatly arranged, blanket rolled, the bench wiped clean of shavings and dust. Only the faintest indentation in the frost-covered earth showed where he'd slept. As though the cold had politely stepped aside for him. But something else remained. A pair of boots. Not just any boots. These were unlike anything Penlow had seen. They sat precisely at the edge of the granary awning, their toes just kissing the sunlit cobblestones. They were made from leather so dark it absorbed the morning light. With laces like strands of black silk and soles too finely sewn to have been crafted by ordinary hands. They were perfect. Not a scuff, not a bend, not a mark on them, except, curiously, for a single thread of silver stitched into the inner ankle of each one. A signature, perhaps, or something else. Miss Etta was not the first to see them, but she was the first to notice that they didn't belong to anyone. Villagers passed, looked, admired. I wonder who he made them for, said Mrs. Ballin, who sold eggs and gossip in equal measure. Too fine for anyone around here, muttered Mr. Dreyer, who had worn the same pair of boots for 23 years and still insisted they had another 10 in them. Children dared each other to touch them. None did. By noon, the boots still sat there, untouched, unclaimed, unspoken for. And that night, just as before, the lantern lit again. Same steady glow. Same silent start. The shoemaker emerged once more, calm as always, the satchel slung over one shoulder. But Etta noticed something different. He glanced at the boots. Just briefly, a flick of the eyes. Barely a breath. Then he set to work again. Tap, tap, stitch, pull. And again. Etta watched. But her attention wasn't on his hands this time, it was on his face. Because in that moment of glance, before he returned to his rhythmic labor, she could have sworn she saw something. Not pride, not confusion, but sadness. A deep, quiet sadness that came and went like a ripple in still water. And the next morning? The boots were gone. Not stolen, no. No one in Penlow would dare. They had simply vanished. Just as quietly as they'd arrived. Etta knew then, without evidence, without logic, that the boots had not been made for someone in the village. They had been made for someone who never came. Or perhaps someone who never could. And that made her wonder. How many more boots had he made? How many nights had he worked not for coin or commission, But for memory? She poured herself a second cup of chamomile that night. The lantern flickered on, and she kept watching. Part 4. The note pinned with a needle. It was on the fourth night, just as Miss Etta had started believing nothing more unusual could occur, that the note appeared. Not a grand gesture, not a parchment nailed to the door, just a small square of paper, pinned to the post beside the shoemaker's bench with the tip of a slender cobbler's needle. No one saw it being placed there. No one saw who had written it. But Etta noticed it the moment the shoemaker arrived. His routine was so practiced, so precise, that even the smallest change became obvious. That night, he hesitated before sitting down. His hand moved toward the needle, not quickly, not urgently, but with a kind of reverence, as if he already knew what it said, and yet still had to read it. He didn't remove it, he just touched the corner of the paper, let his fingers rest there for a moment, and then returned to his work. He didn't glance at it again. But Etta did. The next morning, after ensuring no one was nearby, she crossed the square, something she'd not dared to do before. She wore her scarf pulled low, and in her coat pocket, she carried a biscuit for cover, in case anyone asked why she was out so early. The note was still there. It was written in a delicate, almost spidery hand, too neat for a villager's scrawl. And though Etta was not one to snoop, or so she told herself, she leaned close and read the message aloud. Under her breath, "He doesn't remember me, but I remember him. The slippers still fit. I still wear them." That was all. No name, no address, just those lines, strange and tender, like the last page of a forgotten story. Etta stared at the words for a long time. It was not quite love, not quite longing. It felt older than both. Something mournful and grateful at once. And the phrase, "still fit," echoed in her thoughts all the way back to her door. That night, the lantern lit earlier than usual. The shoemaker was already at the bench by twilight, tools in hand before the sky had lost all its gold. He worked more slowly, not from weariness, but from thought, as if his fingers were listening to memories they could only translate through motion. And there was a softness to his expression now, the way his brow remained unfurrowed, the way his breath moved in rhythm with the thread he pulled. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't sad either. He was remembering. And as Etta watched, something within her stirred, a strange blend of comfort and distance, the sense that she was watching something sacred. Private. She thought of going down there, of asking who wrote the note, of saying something kind, but her feet never moved. Instead, she brewed an extra cup of tea, placed it on the sill beside her, and whispered into the empty room, "I hope they wear them in warmth." And though she knew it was only her imagination, she fancied, just faintly, that she saw the shoemaker nod. Part 5. The night it rained and he didn't move. Penlow was not known for its dramatic weather. The seasons arrived with little fanfare. The winters were tolerable if not mild, and most storms came with enough warning for shutters to be latched and stew to be prepared. But every so often, a wild wind would roll in from the eastern hills, sudden and sleepless, all rattling windows and crooked lightning. On the fifth night of Etta's watching, such a storm arrived. It started as a drizzle, a curtain of fine mist settling over the thatch roofs, turning dirt roads to syrup and sending chickens waddling for cover. By the time the lantern flickered to life, the rain had become a steady, slanted fall, thick enough to blot out the stars and paint the square in watery shadow. Etta almost didn't climb to her window that night. Almost. But habit and curiosity are persistent things. Wrapped in 2 shawls, her slippers damp from fetching in firewood, she lit her smallest candle and peered through the narrow window pane. She expected to see nothing. Perhaps the bench abandoned, the tools packed away, the shoemaker tucked into some hidden shelter he'd never before used. Instead, he was there, exactly as he always was, sitting beneath the awning, rain hissing on the wooden shingles above him, a small stream forming near his left boot. The lantern glowed steadily beside him, immune to the wind, its light catching in the droplets that beaded on the edge of his brow. He wasn't working. He was sitting still, very still. His hands rested on the table, palms down, as though bracing for something. His head was bowed, not in sleep, but in thought, or prayer, or both. Etta watched, unmoving. The storm thickened, the kind of rain that made dogs howl and horses whimper. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the entire square for one stark moment, and in that second, She saw his eyes. Open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. She gripped her teacup a little tighter. There was no fear in those eyes. But no peace either. Just waiting. The candle on her sill flickered once, then went out, and in the dimness that followed, she whispered to the darkness, "Why don't you go inside?" Of course, no answer came, but across the square, the shoemaker slowly raised one hand and placed it over his chest, just for a moment, before returning it to the table. A gesture. A response? Etta didn't know. But by morning, the storm had passed. The square steamed with puddles and mud. The bench was dry again. The tools had been put away. And the shoemaker was already gone. But something new had been left behind. A bundle of cloth, tied with twine, resting on the workbench. Inside? A pair of rain shoes, woven from reeds, sealed with wax, stitched with care. And a note. Not pinned, not hidden, just laid neatly atop the bundle. For the woman who watches. Thank you for remembering me, even when I forget myself. Etta sat down slowly on the nearest step. She read the note again. And when the chill breeze swept through the square, she clutched the bundle close, not for warmth, but for the ache that bloomed in her chest. A kind ache. An ache that said, "You're part of something now." Part 6: The Shoemaker's Box of Misfit Souls. A week passed without another note. The lantern still lit each evening, precise as ever. The shoemaker still appeared just after sundown, emerging silently from the shadows as if he were made of them. His hands moved with the same grace and rhythm, but now, Etta noticed, a new ritual had joined the old. Each night, before beginning his work, he would reach beneath his bench and withdraw a small wooden box. It was no larger than a loaf of bread, built from ash wood and brass hinges, worn smooth from years of touch. It bore no lock, no label, but the moment his fingers touched it, his entire demeanor changed. He would sit with it for a moment, unmoving, resting his thumbs gently on its lid. Then, slowly, deliberately, he'd open it. Etta's candle burned low the first night she saw this new routine. She leaned forward, straining through the glass and the darkness, wondering what such a box could contain. Not coins, the shoemaker rarely accepted them. Not letters, his life was silent and solitary. But then he turned the box slightly, just enough for the light of his lantern to catch what was inside. Shoes. Tiny ones. Some barely the size of a walnut. Some shaped like animals, a rabbit, a fox, even what looked like a bear with stitched eyes and a curious tilt to its step. There were lopsided boots, velvet slippers with no matching pair, wooden sandals smoothed into impossible curves. None of them were complete. All of them were strange. And each night, he took out one and placed it gently on the bench in front of him, as if honoring it. Then, and only then, would he begin to work. Etta was no stranger to grief. She had buried a husband in spring and a brother in fall. She had watched over infants who never took a second breath and tended to mothers who bled too much to stay. And yet, what she saw on the shoemaker's face in those moments before the first stitch, that soft blend of reverence and sorrow, felt older than any grief she'd known. He was remembering something. Someone. Perhaps many someones. The shoes were never worn, never sold, never changed. At the end of each night, he'd return the chosen one to its velvet nest within the box and close the lid with a sigh so soft Etta could almost hear it. On the third night of watching this ritual, Etta did something uncharacteristic. She left her window, creeping down the stairs, shawl wrapped tight. She stepped onto her porch and crossed the silent square. The air was crisp. No one stirred. Her slippers made almost no sound on the stone. She left a single item on the shoemaker's bench, a small bottle of lavender oil, sealed with wax, tied with a note that read, "For the shoes that remember, may they always be treated gently." She didn't wait to see if he'd read it. She didn't ask questions. She simply returned to her seat by the candle, heart thrumming like a drum at half beat. That night, for the first time since she began watching him, he looked up at her window. Not long, not dramatically, just long enough to raise his hand in quiet thanks. And beneath the warm yellow light of his lantern, Etta raised her cup in reply. Not a toast, not a farewell, just a shared moment. One shoemaker, one watcher, two people who knew that some things are better left unspoken, but never unseen. Part 7: The pair made from memory. The village of Penlow. like many small villages wrapped in moss and memory, had a rhythm of forgetting. Each season replaced the one before it like pages in a slow-turning book. News didn't travel far, nor did it last long. But still, every so often, something unusual would echo just a bit longer than expected. The story of the shoemaker's night work, once considered odd, had softened into something more like myth. Children still whispered about him when playing hide and seek near the granary. Travelers asked vague questions over ale mugs at the inn, but to most villagers, he had become part of the night itself, expected, quiet, and ignored, except by Miss Etta Woolsey, and perhaps by one other. On the 7th night since the lavender offering, the lantern lit as usual, not early, not late. The shoemaker emerged without fanfare. His cloak was dusted with something pale, flour, perhaps, or the powder of dried leaves, and his shoulders seemed weighed by more than his satchel. Etta had expected him to reach for the box, but that night, he did not. Instead, he opened his satchel and withdrew a bundle wrapped in linen, not one of his usual bundles of leather or tools, but something long, narrow, and soft-edged. He set it on the bench, unwrapped it slowly, and what emerged took Etta's breath from behind the window. A pair of shoes. Not boots, not clogs, not the usual sturdy work of a cobbler's trade. These were different. They were elegant, but not grand, simple, but impossibly detailed. A deep green velvet, the color of river moss in morning sun, shaped into soft curves with delicate stitching in a shade of pale sky blue. Along the back seam, a tiny loop of thread glimmered silver, like the night sky stitched into the heel. They were shoes for dancing, but they did not match any fashion Etta had seen in her lifetime. Nor, she suspected, in anyone else's. As the shoemaker turned them gently under the lamplight, inspecting each curve and stitch, something shifted in his expression. It was not pride, nor weariness. It was loss. The kind of loss that doesn't sting anymore, but never really leaves. Then he did something new. He spoke. Etta could not hear him. Of course, not from the window across the square, with the wind curling around the rooftops. But she saw his lips move, saw his hand rest gently on the toe of the left shoe. And she imagined what he might be saying. Not to the shoes, to the person who once wore them, or might have worn them, or was supposed to. When he finished, he did not place the shoes in his box. He didn't even wrap them again. He left them on the bench. And for the first time, he did not sleep beside them. Instead, he walked to the far edge of the square, where the boundary stones marked the old road. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, as if waiting for someone long overdue. Then he returned, not with sadness, but with peace. And the next morning, the shoes were gone. Not stolen, not sold, gone. Etta didn't ask questions. She simply wrote a note and pinned it to the post. They were beautiful. I hope they danced. And she imagined, or perhaps didn't, that the shoemaker smiled when he read it. Part 8. The visitor who didn't knock. The shoemaker was not known to have visitors. In fact, most of Penlow would have sworn, confidently, and with the kind of certainty small villages specialize in, that he had no visitors at all. No relatives, no friends, no merchants from out of town, not even customers, at least not in the usual sense. Shoes appeared, people left coins, no one spoke. But on the 8th night since Etta had begun writing notes as well as watching, someone came. She saw it before it began. There was no lantern that night. Not at first. The square sat in deepening dusk, the air heavy with the smell of soil and wood smoke. Etta had just poured her tea, chamomile again, though tonight it had a sharper edge of mint, when she noticed the absence. The lantern usually flickered to life just as the first stars woke. But this time, nothing. The granary remained dark. The bench, empty. The air, too still. Then a shadow moved. Not from the shoemaker's usual path, no. This one came from the main road, the long cobbled track that led to the distant hills and the world beyond Penlow. A figure, tall, cloaked, neither hurried nor hesitant. Their walk was smooth, but not familiar. They carried something slung across their back, not a pack, not a case, something softer, longer. Etta leaned forward, breath fogging her window pane. The figure stepped beneath the awning and stood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the lantern lit, not slowly, not gradually. All at once, a full flare of golden light that cast deep shadows across the square and lit the underside of the figure's hood. Etta couldn't see their face. But the shoemaker saw them. Because he arrived not a moment later. Not from the back alley, as he usually did, but from the far edge of the square, as if he'd been waiting nearby. Watching. He didn't carry his satchel. Didn't wear his apron. He approached the visitor like someone approaching memory. No words were spoken, or if they were spoken in silence. The visitor reached for the object on their back. Unwrapped it. It was a single shoe. Just one. And it was broken. Not shattered. Not torn, but clearly wounded. Its side split from its sole. The laces frayed and gray. A ribbon, once bright, dangled loose from the heel. The shoemaker took it into his hands like one might take a wounded bird. He turned it slowly. He closed his eyes. And then he nodded. The visitor bowed. Just once. And left. Etta watched until the cloak vanished beyond the square. Then she watched the shoemaker sit down at the bench. Alone once more. But he did not begin to work. Not that night. He placed the broken shoe beside him. He looked at it. And he wept. Not loudly. Not with shaking shoulders. But with the kind of weeping that happens quietly. Behind the eyes. When something long forgotten is remembered too clearly. Etta's own eyes blurred. And in the candle's glow. She whispered. Whoever they were, they remembered. Too. The next morning. The broken shoe was gone. But the lantern stayed lit until dawn. Part 9. The Shoemaker's One Silent Song. It was not known whether the shoemaker ever spoke aloud to anyone. To customers, he nodded. To children, he smiled faintly. To the old farmer who brought him cracked heels each winter, he offered no more than a wave. His language had always been his hands, the tap of tools, the slide of thread, the low thud of leather being shaped on the last. But on the ninth night, something different happened. He sang. Not in the way one sings for company. Or even in joy. It was soft. Breathless. A tone more than a tune. Like the echo of a lullaby half remembered from another life. Etta almost missed it entirely. Her window was cracked open slightly to let in the spring air. And she'd been writing, a letter to no one. A habit she'd taken up long before the shoemaker arrived. But then, drifting across the square like the scent of wild thyme, it came. A single note. Low. Wavering. Then another. And another. It wasn't music the way a harpist might play. Or a fiddler in the inn. It was something older. Slower. A sound with no beginning and no end. As if the shoemaker were humming to time itself. Coaxing it to pass more gently. She leaned against the frame. The lantern glowed brighter that night, not hotter. But more golden. Its light seemed to dance in time with the song. Casting soft shadows across the workbench as if the ghosts of shoes long past were joining in the rhythm. He did not sing words. But Etta understood them nonetheless. The kind of song that meant, you are remembered. The kind of song that meant, I do this for you. And perhaps, I am still here, because you were once with me. When she looked closer, she saw what he was working on. Not shoes. Not boots. But a slipper. Just one. It was shaped like the ones a child might wear to a winter feast, stitched in soft gray wool. Lined with lambskin, a tiny bell sewn into the heel that gave no sound. He cradled it as he worked. Every few stitches, he sang a note. By the time the stars had crossed the rooftops, it was done. And what he did next froze Etta's breath in her chest. He didn't wrap it. He didn't place it in the box. He walked across the square. To the old elm tree near the well. And there, at the base, in a hollow softened by time and moss, he placed the slipper. He didn't mark the spot. He didn't speak. He simply touched the bark, lightly, like a farewell, and returned to his bench. The lantern dimmed. The song faded. And the shoemaker slept without his blanket that night. Face turned to the stars. The next morning, Etta crossed the square before dawn. The slipper was gone. But the moss was disturbed. Just slightly. As if a very small foot had come to claim it. She placed a note beneath the bark. I heard the song. I will remember it, too. And as she stepped away, a bell, faint, impossibly faint, chimed once behind her. Part 10. The ledger with no names. It was the kind of evening where the sky turned that specific shade of ink blue, not quite night. Not still day, when shadows stretched just long enough to touch the past. In Penlow, most shops were shuttered by then. Hearths lit, soup simmering, but across the square, The shoemaker's lantern glowed steady. And his hands, as always, were busy. That night, however, Miss Etta noticed something odd. He wasn't working on shoes. He was writing. For as long as she'd watched, Etta had never seen the shoemaker pick up a pen. His fingers, deft and calloused, seemed shaped only for thread and leather. But on this night, he opened a narrow drawer beneath his bench and retrieved a thin, worn ledger bound in dusty red cloth. He turned its pages slowly, as though each one might crumble. And then he began to write. The act was deliberate, his brow furrowed just slightly, the way it might when choosing between souls or fitting an arch. His pen strokes were precise but careful, as though the names, if there were any, could vanish if not honored properly. Etta strained to see, but the angle was wrong. She saw only faint ink against yellowed paper. No names stood out, no headings, no titles, just line after line, not of numbers, but impressions, descriptions, perhaps fragments. She lit a second candle, opened her window wider, and listened. A breeze stirred, and on it came a phrase, soft, spoken aloud by the shoemaker as he wrote. Light steps. Always turned her left heel inward. He dipped his pen again. Another whisper. Liked yellow, though never wore it. Once fell asleep in new shoes out of stubbornness. Etta's heart paused. These were not customers. They were memories. He was writing the lives of the feet he'd once tended, not the people. Not their names, but the tiny truths known only by their shoes. Somewhere on that ledger were stories never told aloud. A boy who walked like he was always late. A woman who paused 3 times before stepping into any room. An old man whose right boot was always more worn because he leaned into laughter. Etta watched him close the ledger gently at last and rest his hand atop it like a final blessing. He didn't return it to the drawer. He simply left it on the bench beside him and closed his eyes. And as he drifted, not to sleep, not quite, but to stillness, the lantern light grew warmer, softer, as if the stories within the ledger had caught fire not in flame, but in glow. That night, Etta couldn't bring herself to write a note. Words, she felt, would only clatter in the presence of such quiet remembrance. So instead, she placed a single daffodil on the edge of her window. A silent tribute, a way of saying, I too remember the way some people walk. Part 11. The pair that never fit. By now, Etta had come to think of the shoemaker's work as less a trade and more a ritual. Each stitch was an echo. Each sole was a memory. Each pair was a story whispered into leather, carefully shaped by hands that seemed more like instruments of the past than flesh and blood. But on the 11th night, something faltered. It began as usual. The lantern lit just as the sun disappeared behind the copse of elder trees. The shoemaker appeared, silent and sure, his satchel over one shoulder. He unpacked his tools, arranged them with precision, and placed a fresh piece of leather on the bench. But something was off. His movements were slower. Not tired, no, but hesitant, as if the materials didn't agree with him. Etta leaned forward. Her tea remained untouched. He began stitching, and she noted, with a pinch of alarm, that he started over. 3 times. The seam wouldn't hold. The tongue wouldn't sit flush. The arch collapsed with the slightest pressure. He worked without frustration, without sighs, but the set of his jaw was tighter. His shoulders, usually relaxed with habit, seemed coiled. And finally, just before midnight, he stopped. In front of him sat a nearly complete pair of shoes. They were made of fine black leather with brown inlays. A wide arch and reinforced heels. The sort of shoe one might expect to see on a quiet librarian or a schoolmaster with poor posture. But they were wrong. Even Etta could tell from her window. One shoe curled upward at the toe. The other slumped slightly at the instep. They didn't match. Not quite. He picked them up, one in each hand, and held them for a long time, not examining them, but weighing them, judging something unspoken. Then he set them down. He reached beneath his bench and retrieved a cloth bag, worn and soft with use. Into it he placed the shoes, tied it with a frayed ribbon, and walked, not toward the road, not toward the elm tree, but toward the well. Etta's candle flickered. She rose, heart in her throat, and slipped down her stairs. By the time she reached the square, he was gone, but the bag was there, resting neatly on the lip of the old stone well, its ribbon fluttering like a whisper in the wind. Etta approached, uncertain. her slippers soaking slightly in the dewy cobbles. She didn't open the bag. She simply touched it, gently, and read the note tucked under the ribbon. I tried. They didn't fit. Maybe they weren't meant to. That night, she didn't sleep, not from fear, but because she kept thinking about all the things in life that never quite fit, and how sometimes we carry them anyway. The next morning, the bag was gone, but someone had left a second note in its place. Not addressed to anyone, not signed, just one line. They were close enough. Thank you. Part 12. The thread that wasn't there. Penlow had a kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones. A quiet that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness, a hum beneath everyday life that reminded you nothing really hurried here. Not the wind, not the birds, not time itself, but on the 12th night, something in that quiet changed. It wasn't louder. It was emptier. Etta noticed it before she even reached her window. The usual background chorus, the coo of doves, the tick of her hallway clock, the occasional creak of the weathered sign above the bakery, had all faded. It was as if the village had paused. Collectively holding its breath, she climbed the stairs, tea in hand, and pushed open the shutters. The lantern was lit. The shoemaker was there, but he wasn't moving. He sat at his bench, staring at his hands. On the table in front of him lay a single shoe, unfinished, and beside it, an empty spool of thread. That, in itself, was not strange. Shoemakers run out of thread. But this was his thread, the kind he never ran out of. A strange, silvery gray fiber that didn't seem to belong to any known spool. He had used it for years without ever being seen to replace it. Etta had never seen him rethread a needle, never seen him dig through satchels for more. And now, for the first time, it was gone. He reached for the spool again, turned it, shook it, held it to the lantern light. Nothing, just the faintest trace of what had been. He did not curse, did not sigh. He simply sat back and stared at the empty bench, hands resting in his lap. Etta leaned forward, heart quietly thudding. Would he stop? Would he leave? Would he finally speak? Instead, he did something she had never seen before. He closed his eyes, and he waited. The lantern dimmed, not because the oil ran low, but because it seemed to respond to his stillness, drawing inward, like a breath being held. Then, from the edge of the square, just beneath the eaves of the old mill house, something moved. A figure, no taller than a child, stepped into view. Not a child, a woman, small, cloaked, carrying nothing. She crossed the cobbles barefoot, her steps silent even on the wet stone. Etta blinked, once, twice, to be sure she wasn't imagining her. The woman reached the bench, said nothing. She simply placed a tiny bundle before the shoemaker. He opened his eyes, unwrapped it. Inside, a new spool. Not gray, not silver, but gold. The kind of gold that glinted like dusk and threadbare sunrises. The kind of gold you couldn't buy, or dye, or name. He looked at it for a long time, then looked at her, and she nodded once, as if to say, "Now you may begin again." She vanished just as quietly as she came. Etta watched the shoemaker thread the needle with that golden thread and returned to his work. His hands moved slower, more carefully, and every stitch shimmered like it had something to say. That night, Etta wrote no note. She simply whispered, "Whoever you were, thank you." And the thread never ran out again. Part 13. The shoes that walked home alone. In Penlow, stories moved slower than the river, and sank even deeper. By the 13th night of her vigil, Etta had started keeping a small journal beside her candle, not filled with facts, but with feelings. She hadn't intended to write a story, but the shoemaker, without ever knowing, was giving her one. That evening, the fog came early. It rolled in from the river bend, swallowing fence posts and creeping up walls. The square became a faded thing, blurred at the edges like a dream you tried too hard to remember. Even the lantern looked different in the fog, dimmer, hazier, less like a beacon and more like a memory pretending to be light. The shoemaker lit it, as always. He arrived, as always. But that night, he didn't bring a satchel. He brought a shoebox, not the kind with a lid, but one carved from pale wood, polished smooth, and banded with copper. It looked almost ceremonial, the sort of box that might hold letters tied in ribbon, or the ashes of someone beloved. He placed it gently on the bench and opened it. Inside, a pair of shoes, already finished. already perfect. They were walking shoes, soft brown leather, well-balanced soles, the sort of make meant for long journeys and safe returns. But these weren't new. No, they were worn, subtly, as if someone had already taken many steps in them, and yet never quite left. Etta leaned closer, her hand tightening on her journal. The shoemaker didn't take out his tools. He didn't stitch or hammer. He simply lifted the shoes and placed them side by side on the ground in front of the bench, facing outward, toward the square. Then, without a sound, he stepped back. The fog thickened. The square fell utterly still. And then, they moved. The shoes. No feet inside them, no hands guiding. Just movement. Slow at first. A shuffle. A slight realignment of toe and heel. Then a soft step. Then another. Across the square. Through the mist. Toward the road. Not hurried. Not ghostly. Just purposeful. Like they were going home. Etta didn't breathe. She followed with her eyes until the fog swallowed them whole. No sound of clatter. No sign of falling. Just a hush. Like the shoes belonged to a world that had finally remembered their path. And then they were gone. The shoemaker stood still. He didn't follow. He only turned back to his bench and reached into the now empty box. Inside, a note. He didn't write it. That much Etta was sure of. But he read it, folded it once, placed it in his pocket. And only then did he light the small coil of cedarwood beside his lantern, a rare thing, reserved only for nights of remembrance. Etta's journal entry that night was short. The shoes left, but not empty. And beside that line, she drew a single footprint, pointing home. Part 14, the pair that refused to be finished. By the 14th night, Etta had begun to notice a pattern. Not in the shoemaker's movements, those had always been steady, faithful, unchanging in their own quiet way, but in the meaning behind the shoes. Some were for people who never came. Others were for memories that lingered. Still others were offerings, tokens, or messages that could only be read by the heart. But this night was different again. This night, something resisted. The shoemaker arrived later than usual, only by a few minutes. But in Penlow, minutes held weight. He walked slower. His satchel hung heavier. The lantern took 2 strikes to light instead of 1. He placed a half-finished pair of boots on the bench. They were rugged, broad-toed, heavy-soled, meant for mud and bramble and unpaved paths. Boots for someone who walked to forget. But the shoemaker didn't begin where he normally did. He sat down, just sat, and stared at them. Etta watched, hand hovering over her teacup. He picked up his awl, placed it down again, picked up his thread, set it aside. Then, very slowly, he picked up the left boot and examined it, turning it over, pressing gently against the heel, testing the bend of the sole. And then he spoke. One word. Etta couldn't hear it, but she saw his lips form it. No, not angry, not frustrated, just final. He tried again. He positioned the boot, threaded his needle, made a single stitch, stopped. Something about the boots refused. They wouldn't take shape. They wouldn't obey. Every time he tried to finish them, the leather puckered, the seam twisted, the toe collapsed ever so slightly. No matter how he adjusted the cut. He exhaled, a sound so soft it barely moved the lantern's glow. And then he did something even Etta didn't expect. He took the boots in both hands, and held them to his chest. Not possessively, not protectively, but like a man mourning something he couldn't put into words. His eyes closed. He didn't cry, but Etta knew, somehow, that the person for whom those boots were intended would never wear them. Perhaps they had passed. Perhaps they had chosen another path. Perhaps they had simply disappeared. Whatever the reason, the boots resisted completion because they knew. The shoemaker stood, walked to the granary's side wall, and placed them inside a small alcove beneath the eaves, a place no rain could reach. No wind could jostle. He wrapped them in a cloth, tucked dried sage between them, and left a note only long enough for the breeze to read. You didn't come back, but I still made them. Etta closed her journal that night without writing. Some shoes, she thought, were meant to remain unfinished. Some journeys never resume. But even so, the effort to make them still mattered. Part 15, the map in the insole. The 15th night came with rain. Soft and steady. The kind that blurred the edges of everything it touched. Roof tiles ran slick. Cobblestones glistened. And the elder trees bent slightly as if bowing to a slow, invisible rhythm. Etta had prepared a thicker tea this time, ginger and bay leaf, for the cold in her knees, and wrapped herself in the quilt from her childhood bed. The one stitched by a mother whose voice she barely remembered, but whose hands had known how to comfort in the language of fabric. Across the square, the shoemaker's lantern flickered awake. But what caught her attention tonight was not the light, it was the scroll. He carried it under one arm, wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with black twine. It was longer than a ledger, shorter than a walking stick, and treated with unusual care. Before even setting down his tools, he placed the scroll on the bench, carefully unwrapped it, and spread it flat. It was a map, old, cracked at the edges, ink faded to a whisper. Not a merchant's map, not a soldier's. This was personal, hand-drawn, with paths that curved uncertainly, rivers that meandered as if unsure of their own course. The shoemaker studied it as though it were a letter from someone long lost. Then he took a pair of child-sized shoes from his satchel. They were no more than 5 inches long, soft, flexible, made from sky blue suede with a single stitch of gold down the center of each tongue. They bore no laces, only loops for tiny fingers, shoes for a journey not yet walked. And then, with a gesture so practiced it could not have been the first time, he flipped the left shoe over and peeled back the insole. Not carelessly, delicately. Inside, etched into the leather, was a map. A miniature version of the scroll before him. A mirror of every path, every turn, every hill and glen, not with names, but with signs. A broken tree, a crooked fence, a stone shaped like a sleeping cat. Clues only the intended wearer might one day understand. Etta leaned so far forward she nearly toppled her candle. Why hide a map in a child's shoe? Who would follow it? Was it for someone lost? Or someone yet to come? The shoemaker touched one corner of the scroll and traced it slowly, matching the movement on the sole of the shoe. Then, without a word, he stitched the insole shut again, not to conceal, but to protect. He wrapped the shoes in a square of muslin, tied it with soft thread, and placed them in a wooden box lined with wool. He didn't bury them, didn't send them. He simply set the box at the edge of his bench and rested his hand atop it for a very long time. Etta understood, though no one would have believed her. The shoes were a message, not to be delivered, but to be found, someday, by someone who needed them. And maybe, just maybe, they'd know how to read the road hidden beneath their feet. She whispered to the window, "Let them find the way." And across the square, the lantern flared, just once, in quiet reply. Part 16. The pair that returned without feet. It was just past the new moon when the shoemaker received something no one ever thought to give him. His own shoes. Returned. They appeared at dawn. Etta noticed them before her morning tea even brewed, a pair of well-worn, soft-soled shoes resting neatly on the center of the bench. Their leather was aged, cracked at the seams. The stitching had come undone in places. Mud crusted the toes, and one heel was flattened, as if the wearer had walked on uneven ground for far too long. But the bench had been empty when Etta extinguished her candle the night before. And the shoemaker, as always, had vanished into the dark long before the first rooster crowed. Yet here they were, old, familiar, and not his. She knew his boots, plain, durable, silent. These were different. These had history, personality, a kind of weary dignity, like they'd seen too much to ever complain. And inside them, a note. Not folded, not pinned, just resting there, nestled in the hollow where toes once pressed. "They brought me home. I thought they belonged to you now." That night, the shoemaker approached them slowly, as if afraid they might vanish. He picked up the left shoe first, turned it in his palm, then pressed his thumb gently against the side. A tiny crease opened. Inside it, barely visible to Etta's eye, but clear enough under the lantern's glow, was a marking. Not a brand, not a name, just a symbol. A circle crossed by a single line. The shoemaker froze, then sat, and for the next hour, he did not work. He simply cleaned them. He washed the mud from the leather, brushed the dust from the seams, applied a balm to the places that had cracked. He stitched the heel, polished the toe, and when he was done, he didn't place them on the shelf. He placed them on the ground, facing the road, not the village, the road, as if waiting for another journey, or for someone to follow. Etta watched, mouth slightly open, and for the first time, she wondered, were all the shoes he made meant to be returned? Were they not gifts or services, but something stranger? Something circular? Something sacred? She didn't know. But that night, she left no note. Just a thread, golden, fine, looped around her doorknob. A silent offering. Across the square, the shoemaker lit his lantern early, and it glowed with a warmth she hadn't seen since spring. Part 17. The Shoemaker's Night Without Work. There had never been a night in Penlow without the rhythm of the shoemaker's tools. The faint tapping of his awl, the slow tug of his thread, the creak of leather yielding to memory, all sounds that blended into the village's sense of time itself. Etta had grown used to them. They were as constant as the stars and as comforting as the smell of her evening tea. But on the 17th night, everything stopped. The lantern lit, as always. The bench stood ready. But the shoemaker did not sit. He stood behind the bench, hands resting flat on the edge, eyes closed as if he were listening to a sound that no one else could hear. A sound buried beneath time, perhaps, or memory, or grief. Etta watched. Tea forgotten. Hands still. He didn't move. For minutes. For hours. Just stood. The shoes from the previous night, the ones returned, mended, polished, still sat near the road. Untouched. Silent as stones. And then, slowly, the shoemaker reached beneath the bench and brought out something not seen before. A cloth. Not the usual oil rag or polishing scrap, but a piece of dark velvet. He unfolded it with the same reverence he used for the child's map shoes or the box of misfit soles. And inside, nestled like a relic, was something simple. A key. Iron, long, and strangely smooth. The kind of key made not for locks but for places. For moments, he held it for a long time, then placed it on the bench. And he waited. That was all. He didn't cut leather, didn't measure soles, didn't even touch a thread. He just stood beside the key, watching it, guarding it, perhaps inviting it to be claimed. Etta did not know what it opened. No door in Penlow had ever needed such a thing. But the weight of it, the way the lantern's light curved around its shadow, told her it was not ordinary. This was not a night for shoes. It was a night for rest, but not of the body. Of something deeper. She watched until the lantern dimmed. He did not sleep. He did not move. He simply stayed. Like a marker in time. Like the key was too important to leave, even for a moment. And Etta understood, without quite knowing how, that sometimes, work isn't what you do with your hands. It's what you guard with your silence. She left a single word on a slip of paper, tucked behind the stone near his bench. It said, "I see you." And in the morning, the key was gone, but a faint circle of velvet remained, as if it had sunk slightly into the world, leaving behind not a hole, but a memory. Part 18. The bench that shifted overnight. By the 18th evening, the people of Penlow had begun to notice little things. The innkeeper's daughter, carrying towels to the upstairs rooms, mentioned once that the lantern's glow looked different lately, warmer. Like it had remembered something. A boy chasing a goose through the square said he'd tripped on a cobblestone that hadn't been there before. And Mrs. Ballin, who claimed to know everything about everyone, swore she saw the shoemaker's bench move 6 inches west without anyone touching it. Etta didn't laugh, because she had seen it too. The change was subtle. The bench, where the shoemaker had always sat, stitched, and dreamed, now angled slightly toward the elm tree instead of the road. A small thing, but in Penlow, small things mattered. That night, when the lantern flared and the shoemaker arrived, Etta watched with a sharper eye. He didn't react to the shift, didn't straighten the bench or mutter in annoyance. Instead, he ran his hand along the new position, the grain of the wood, the edge of the plank, and nodded, as if the bench had chosen for itself. He placed no shoes on the table that night. Instead, he brought out something entirely unfamiliar. A book, bound in cracked brown leather, its spine stitched like one of his own creations. He opened it not from the beginning, but from the center, and began to write. Not just notes, not just memories. Etta could see the ink bleeding thick across the pages in lines too steady to be casual. A record, a marking, a ledger of what had been done. She thought of the returned shoes, the lost slipper, the golden thread, the unfinished boots in the alcove. All of them, accounted for. He wrote for hours, and then, for the first time, he opened the other side of the book, the unwritten pages, and paused. He stared into the blankness as though waiting for it to speak. Then, he wrote one name, Just one. Etta couldn't see it from her window. But she felt it, the weight of it, the way a silence thickens around truth. The shoemaker gently closed the book, laid it flat, and touched the cover with the side of his palm. Then he stood, walked around the bench, and looked toward her window. Not past it, not beside it, at it. Etta didn't flinch. She simply raised her candle slightly. A gesture of presence. And he nodded. Not a greeting, a confirmation. He knew she'd been watching. And now, it seemed, her name had been added. Not as a customer, not as a witness, but as something harder to define. A participant, a piece of the story that could no longer sit only at a distance. And that night, she slept with the window open, not to listen, not to spy, but so that if the shoemaker ever needed her, the way would be clear. Part 19. The night without a lantern. There had never been a night without the lantern. Not since Etta had started watching. Not since the shoemaker first arrived in Penlow. Or at least since the village began to notice him. The soft golden glow that flared to life just after dusk was as predictable as the phases of the moon, and, to some, just as sacred. But on the 19th night, the lantern did not light. The square fell into a deeper dark than Etta had ever seen. Not the comforting kind, with stars like pinpricks and the rustle of branches in the wind. This was a dark that pressed close. A dark that seemed to absorb even the glint of moonlight on slate roofs. And yet, despite the absence of light, the shoemaker was there. She saw him only by the silhouette he cast, a soft figure framed by the shape of the granary and the shimmer of dew in the air. He didn't bring tools, didn't bring shoes. He brought a candle, a small one, thin, pale, unremarkable. He lit it with a match, shielding the flame with one hand, and he placed it not on the bench, not near his work, but on the ground, at the base of the bench. Then he sat, not to work, but to listen. Etta held her breath. The candle barely flickered. It cast almost no light, yet it seemed to pull in something, as if the darkness itself had begun to hum, not a sound, but a presence, a stillness that vibrated faintly in the bones. And then, something even stranger happened. One by one, small lights began to appear. Not from houses, not from lamps, but from shoes, scattered through the square, pairs placed on stoops, hung from rafters, tucked beneath awnings, shoes the shoemaker had made. Old ones, forgotten ones. They began to glow, softly. From within, the soles shimmered faintly, the stitching lit like veins of gold under skin. Etta's own slippers, the ones she'd tucked near the fire, pulsed once. Like a heartbeat, she stood, crossed to the window, and saw that every pair of shoes the shoemaker had ever made for someone who still remembered him, responded. They lit up not because of magic, but because they had been made with memory. And memory, once accepted, once honored, glows. She looked across the square and saw him watching the lights with no pride. No surprise. Only calm. Only rest. He had made things that lasted. And now they spoke, even in his silence. Etta lit her own candle, matching his, and placed it on her windowsill beside her slippers. They glowed together. A conversation of quiet light. The lantern had not failed. It had simply passed the task along. Part 20. The Whisper in the Soul. The 20th night began in silence, as most did in Penlow. But there was something different about the air, a stillness not of peace, but of expectation. The kind of stillness that made dogs glance at empty corners. That made floorboards creak without reason. That made even the river seem to pause in its course. Etta felt it too. She boiled her tea slower. Chose peppermint tonight, something steady, something honest. She lit her candle early, placed her slippers by the fire, and climbed to the window. The lantern had returned. So had the shoemaker. But something was waiting. He didn't reach for thread. Didn't open the drawer with the velvet box. Instead, he took from his satchel a single shoe, worn, cracked, its heel badly caved in. A walking shoe, once white, now the pale gray of old smoke. He placed it gently on the bench. And then, he listened. Not in the ordinary way. Not to the breeze or the creaking wood or the call of owls. But to the shoe itself. He turned it in his hands, held it to his ear, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then he smiled, just a little. He opened a side drawer of the bench, one Etta had never seen him use, and drew out a tiny instrument, part awl, part needle, part something older. A tool not used for making, but revealing. And with it, he carefully peeled back the sole. Etta leaned forward, heart slow, breath shallowed to stillness. Inside the shoe, where the insole had been, was not padding, nor thread, but paper. Old, crumbling, folded small and tight into the curve of the arch. He removed it with a reverence usually reserved for funerals. He unfolded it, read it, then turned it over. On the back, a message was written in ink so faded it had turned the color of dusk. If ever I forget myself, look where I walked the most. The shoemaker closed his eyes, held the paper to his chest, and whispered something to it. Etta saw his lips move, but could not hear the words. And when he was done, he didn't place the note in a book. He didn't store it in a box. He stitched it back into the shoe, resealed the sole, smoothed it with oil, polished it gently, and placed it on the far corner of the bench, heel toward the granary wall, as if to face memory, not the road. Then he sat, not to rest, but to remember. Etta whispered aloud, "Where you walked the most." And for the first time, she understood. Not all shoes are made to be worn. Some are made to carry messages. Some, to return people to themselves. And some are simply reminders of where we've been, when we no longer remember who we are. That night, she didn't write a note. She simply traced the bottom of her own slipper with a finger and whispered to it, "Remember me, just in case I forget." Part 21. The sound of a shoe that hadn't been made. It was nearly the solstice, and Penlow's nights had grown longer, stretched thin like an old cloth left too long in the sun. The stars hung lower, the air tasted of damp pine, fires burned longer, and even the candles seemed reluctant to die. Etta sat by her window, wrapped in the same quilt she'd used for weeks now, the corners frayed from fingers twisting and thought. She didn't make tea that evening. Something told her to keep her senses clear. Across the square, the lantern flared to life, not early, not late, perfectly on time. The shoemaker stepped out from the granary's side, not with his satchel or any visible tool, but with nothing at all. He stood before the bench for several long minutes, as if waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. And then, slowly, he bent down and listened to the earth. He placed his palm on the cobblestone, then both hands, then his ear. Etta didn't move. Even the inn's cat, usually prowling the eaves at this hour, seemed to freeze in its steps. The square was silent, but the shoemaker heard something. He stood suddenly, eyes wide, not in alarm, but in realization. He reached behind the bench, pulled out a piece of leather, not one she recognized. It was dark green, almost black, with a strange sheen, like moss in the rain. He placed it on the table, smoothed it with his palms, and traced something into it with his finger. There was no shoe on the bench, but he began working, cutting, shaping, threading a needle. Etta saw no form at first. The leather didn't want to become anything, but he kept working, as if the shape were hiding just beneath the surface. And slowly, it revealed itself. A slipper, then a boot, then neither. A form both familiar and not, like something remembered from a dream. A style from no village, no country, no time. It took him 3 hours. He never stopped, never looked up, and when it was done, he stepped back and waited. Not long after, just as the clock at the chapel struck midnight, a gust of wind rushed through the square, startling the weather vanes, stirring the coals in distant hearths. And someone arrived, not walked, not emerged, arrived. Etta saw them only in pieces, a figure of shadow, tall, unsure, wrapped in something that moved too slowly for fabric. They stepped to the bench, looked at the shoe, and, without a word, placed their bare foot inside it. It fit perfectly. They looked up at the shoemaker. He nodded, and they vanished, just like that, gone, as if they had only been waiting for the right shoe to find their way forward. Etta's hands trembled as she wrote that night. Only one line. He made a shoe for someone who hadn't happened yet. Part 22. The pair that were never worn. There was a small cupboard beneath the shoemaker's bench that he rarely opened. Etta had only seen him use it once or twice, always with care. Always with a pause before touching the latch. She imagined it as a place for tools that had been retired, or pieces of leather not suited to his current work. But on the 22nd night, he opened it with a different kind of stillness. Not the stillness of caution, the stillness of remembering. He removed a box, cedar, worn smooth, sealed with waxed linen and tied with ribbon the color of candle ash. He untied it slowly, reverently, and inside were shoes. A pair of them. Children's shoes. Small, yet not new, not pristine. They looked untouched, as if they had been made with love and placed in the box before the world had a chance to scuff them. The stitching was immaculate, the soles unworn, the laces never threaded through an eyelet. Etta knew, before he even moved, that these were not shoes to be delivered, not to be worn, not even to be returned. They were shoes waiting. But for what? The shoemaker didn't take up a tool. He didn't add to them. He didn't polish them. He simply held them, one in each hand, and stared for a long time. The square was so quiet Etta could hear the faint creak of her own floorboards beneath her chair. Even the wind seemed to press close. Pausing, listening. Then, in the low light of the lantern, he did something he had never done before. He placed the shoes side by side in the center of the bench, stepped back, and bowed, not dramatically, not for show, but deeply, like one might bow to someone older, someone sacred. Etta felt her breath catch, because this was not a bow of performance. It was grief, and honor, and remembrance bound together in gesture. He remained bowed for a moment, then sat quietly beside the shoes, not touching them, not even looking at them. And Etta understood something she hadn't before. These shoes had never been worn, and they never would be. They weren't made for feet. They were made for love, for someone who had been hoped for, but never arrived, and the shoemaker had kept them safe, year after year, waiting for a night quiet enough, gentle enough, to honor them. Etta didn't write a note. She didn't whisper anything. She simply lit 2 candles in her window, one for each shoe, and left them to burn until morning. When she woke, they were gone, and across the square, on the shoemaker's bench, sat a single white feather. Part 23. The visitor who left only laces. There was no fog that night. No wind, no sound of distant hoofbeats, no creak of shutters or bark of dogs. Penlow sat in stillness so complete it felt as though time had drawn a soft woolen blanket over the entire village. And in that quiet, something arrived. Not a traveler, not a ghost, something in between. Etta saw them first as a shimmer, just at the edge of the square, near the tree stump that had not grown in 30 years. They stepped into view not as a shape, but as the suggestion of one, a coat with too many buttons, boots that left no footprints, a shadow that leaned against nothing. They didn't approach the bench. They circled it, once, twice, then a third time, slower. The shoemaker didn't flinch. He was already there, seated as though he had been waiting. On the bench beside him, no tools, no shoes, just a coil of black cord, laces, long, worn, and untied. The visitor stopped. Etta held her breath. And then, without speaking, the visitor extended their hand. It held nothing, yet the gesture was unmistakable, a request. The shoemaker nodded, picked up the laces, and began tying, not into shoes, into something else. His hands moved with purpose, threading knot after knot, looping, crossing, tightening, not shoemaking, something older, something ritual, a weave of memory, a braid of absence. When he finished, what lay across his palms wasn't laces anymore. It was a symbol, an intricate figure made only of knots, not readable in words, but somehow known. The visitor took it, held it gently, then removed their boots, set them at the base of the bench. Barefoot now, they turned and walked toward the old road, the one that led not to another village, but to the fields that had long been abandoned to wild time and ruin. They left no trail, but they left behind those boots, worn, weathered, and inside each one, tucked like a secret, a single rose petal, one white, one red. The shoemaker picked them up, turned them in his hands once, then placed them in the corner of the bench. He didn't clean them, didn't mend them. He simply let them rest. Etta, her candle flickering low, wrote only. Some visitors do not arrive to be seen. They come to leave behind what they no longer need. She tied a small knot into the hem of her quilt that night, and dreamed of walking barefoot on soft ground. Part 24. The bench remembered her name. The 24th night came with a softness that Etta couldn't explain. It wasn't in the air or the temperature, though the breeze was kind, and the sky above Penlow shimmered with starlight the color of quiet, but in the way the world itself seemed to be leaning towards something. Something not quite finished, not quite explained. She brewed no tea, lit no candle, just sat by the window with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the hush between her own thoughts. Across the square, the lantern glowed as expected. But tonight, there was no Shoemaker in sight. Not at first. Instead, the bench was already occupied. By what? Not a person. Not quite. By presence. Etta could feel it. The way you feel someone watching you kindly from behind a door. The way an empty room sometimes feels not empty at all. Then, out from the shadow of the granary, the Shoemaker appeared. He walked slower than usual, almost unsure, carrying not leather or thread, but a folded cloth, ivory, lined with faint embroidery. He placed it gently across the bench and smoothed it with his hands. And then, he looked up, at her window, not past it, not vaguely, at her, and with a quiet nod, he stepped back. Etta's chest tightened. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, hands shaking, she stood, crossed the room, and stepped outside. The night air kissed her cheeks with a cool tenderness, and her slippers whispered across the stones as she made her way to the square. The Shoemaker didn't speak. He simply stepped aside, and motioned to the bench. Etta sat, slowly, carefully, as if sitting down were a kind of agreement. The cloth beneath her felt warm, though it had no right to be. The lantern flickered, not as if it were disturbed, but as if it approved. The Shoemaker sat beside her, still silent. Then, from beneath the bench, he brought out something wrapped in old brown paper and string. He offered it to her. She didn't ask. She untied the string, unfolded the paper. Inside, a pair of shoes. Her shoes, but not ones she had worn. Ones he had made for her, perfectly shaped to her quiet footsteps. Her slight lean to the left. Her preference for soft cobbles over rough ones. They were warm, without ever having been worn. Familiar, though she'd never touched them. She looked at him. He smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile. And then, for the first time since the night she'd begun watching him, he spoke aloud. The bench remembered your name. Nothing more, nothing less. And it was enough. She placed the shoes in her lap, and sat with him until the stars dimmed and the first thread of dawn pulled gently at the edges of night. Part 25. The footsteps beneath the floor. The morning after Etta sat on the Shoemaker's bench, something lingered. Not the shoes, those now rested by her bedside, untouched but deeply felt. Not the cloth, that had disappeared sometime before dawn, folded back into the mystery from which it came. It was the sense that something had shifted, not in the village, but beneath it. That day, Etta didn't tend to her garden. She didn't visit the market. She only listened, and what she heard, faint and rhythmic, made her sit still for nearly an hour. Footsteps, under the floorboards, not her own, not creaks or the settling of old wood, but measured, gentle steps, the kind that walked with purpose, as if tracing paths long since laid down and mostly forgotten. She said nothing, did nothing. She simply pressed her palm to the wooden slats and whispered, "You're welcome here." That night, the Shoemaker did not work. Not in the way he usually did. There were no shoes on the bench. No thread. No awl. Instead, he placed a sheet of thick parchment on the table, blank, but for a charcoal rubbing in its center. A single print. Not of a foot. Of a floor. Wide planks. Worn by time. Patterned by hundreds, perhaps thousands, of quiet steps. And on the corner of the parchment, in tiny, almost apologetic handwriting, was a line, "I walk where they once stood." Etta's breath caught. The Shoemaker wasn't making shoes tonight. He was remembering the ground. The journeys beneath the journeys. He opened a long-forgotten drawer in the bench, drew out what looked like a single piece of carved bone, smooth, polished, shaped like a crescent moon. With it, he pressed into the parchment at careful intervals, marking invisible paths. Not maps, not diagrams, echoes. He wasn't preserving the shoes. He was preserving the footsteps. The ones no longer retraceable. The ones carried in the grain of floorboards, in the indentations of thresholds, in the pauses between one breath and the next. And when he finished, he didn't roll the parchment or hide it away. He tucked it under the bench. Then, he stood. He didn't look at her window. Didn't wait for a sign. He simply walked, not away, but down, to the cobbles, to the edge of the square. And then, quite suddenly, into the ground. Not like a ghost. Not like a vanishing, but like someone returning to a room they never truly left. The cobblestones gave no protest. No crack, no light, just silence. And when he was gone, the lantern dimmed. Etta stared for a long time. Then, almost without thinking, she whispered to her floorboards, "If you ever pass through here again, stay as long as you like." Part 26. The leather that wasn't there yesterday. By the 26th evening, the air in Penlow had turned to autumn, brittle and red around the edges. Smoke curled from chimneys a bit earlier, and even the chickens pecked with slower curiosity, as if savoring the last crumbs of warmth before frost made its claim. Etta had begun to sleep in intervals, short, dreamy hours interrupted by the odd sense that something had changed again. Just slightly, just enough. And on that night, something had. The shoemaker's bench was still there. His tools were untouched. The lantern still waited for its spark. But on the surface of the workbench lay a new roll of leather, thick, soft, dark as a raven's wing. It hadn't been there yesterday. She was certain of it. The grain was strange, unfamiliar, not cowhide, not goat, something older, something that shimmered differently when the lantern finally flared to life. The shoemaker appeared minutes later, just as the stars blinked awake. He paused when he saw the leather, not with surprise, with recognition. He touched it once, lightly, and exhaled. Then he brought out a single tool, a blade, curved like a question mark. He didn't draw lines, didn't measure. He began cutting, as if the leather itself already knew what it wanted to become. Etta watched the shape emerge slowly, deliberately. Not shoes this time, slippers, 2 of them, wide, soft-soled, gently curved, not made for travel, but for arrival, for rest. When they were finished, he didn't polish them, didn't line them with fur or cloth. He simply held them, turned them, studied them. Then he reached into his apron and drew out something almost too small to notice. A key, no larger than a thimble. Silver. He placed it gently into the toe of the left slipper and wrapped the pair in plain linen. No box, no ribbon. And then he stood, walked, slowly, steadily, to the front steps of Etta's cottage. She didn't move. She watched from the shadows of her window as he placed the bundle beside her door. Then stepped back, looked up at her light, and nodded. When she opened the door moments later, he was already gone. But the bundle was warm. Inside, the slippers, and the key, and beneath the linen, a note written in a hand she now recognized instantly. "You've walked beside me long enough. These are for when you're ready to stop." She clutched the bundle to her chest and whispered, "Not tonight, but maybe soon." And across the square, the lantern pulsed once, not like a flame, like a heartbeat. Part 27. The shoelaces that tied themselves. By now, the villagers of Penlow had stopped questioning the odd things. The shoemaker's bench had shifted twice more. Children sometimes found tiny souls etched into frost on their windows. An old woman swore that a pair of boots she'd never seen had appeared beside her bed, worn perfectly to her own limp, and when she tried them on, she remembered how to dance. No one laughed. Not anymore. Etta sat by the window as always. But she no longer kept a journal open. She had passed the point of needing to understand. Now, she simply witnessed. And on the 27th night, what she witnessed was small, almost silly, and completely magical. The shoemaker, as usual, lit the lantern. He stepped out, holding a bundle of cloth that flapped slightly in the wind. When he unwrapped it on the bench, Etta saw they were shoes, children's again, small and playful, stitched with a design of winding vines and tiny embroidered bees. But they had no laces. He opened a little tin and removed a coil of lace, thin, waxed, brown with a reddish hue. He didn't thread them. He didn't even try. He placed the lace between the shoes. And waited. Etta blinked. The lace began to move. Just a little at first. Then more confidently. It slid, between the eyelets like a ribbon caught in a current. Up one shoe, down the other, crisscrossing in perfect rhythm, looping without hesitation, until both shoes were laced, not tightly, but correctly, exactly as they should be. As if the laces had done this before. As if they remembered. The shoemaker gave no sign of surprise. He simply smiled, small, tired, full of something Etta didn't have a word for. He took the shoes, now complete, and placed them at the foot of the bench. Left a note beside them. Etta saw the wind turn it just enough for her to read. Some things know how to come home on their own. He lit a match, burned a single sprig of thyme in the corner of the bench. The smoke curled gently upward, carrying something, not scent, not ash, but memory. That night, Etta laid her quilt across her bed not for warmth, but for comfort. She tucked her own slippers closer beneath her chair. And before she blew out her candle, she whispered, "If anything I've lost remembers the way back, the door is open." Part 28. The pair that changed size overnight. There had been strange shoes before. Shoes that glowed, shoes that vanished, shoes that seemed to remember their wearers long after they were gone. But on the 28th night, Etta saw something entirely new. A pair of shoes that refused to stay the same. It started with a simple pair of walking boots, plain brown. Well crafted, nothing extravagant, the kind a thoughtful father might wear on muddy roads. Or a schoolteacher on her morning walk before the bell rang. The shoemaker placed them on the bench just after lighting the lantern. His hands calm, motions steady. Etta watched from her window, noting nothing unusual, until the shoemaker stepped away for only a moment. To retrieve thread? Or oil? She couldn't see. But in that moment, less than a minute, the boots changed. They grew. Slightly. Subtly. Not in a cartoonish way. Not like a trick of the eye. They simply became larger. Half a size. Perhaps. Enough to fit a bigger foot. Or a different one. The shoemaker returned. Paused. Tilted his head. Then placed his hand gently over the toe of the left boot, as if asking a question. The boot shrunk. Back to its original size. The shoemaker sat down slowly. And didn't move for a long time. Etta felt it too. That something deeper than leather was shifting. That these boots weren't simply objects, but participants. They responded not to physical touch, but to need. As the shoemaker resumed work, the boots shifted again, not randomly. In response, when his fingers faltered for a moment, the boots narrowed, like they were compensating. When his shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the soles thickened, as if offering comfort. And finally, when he leaned back and closed his eyes, one of the boots softened, bent, almost leaned back against the bench. With him, Etta had never seen shoes care for their maker before. But these did. When they were finished, he did not place them in a box. He left them by the road. No note, no tag, just a pair of boots. Perfectly sized for whoever needed them most, whoever they became meant for. By morning, they were gone, but in their place was something small. Not a coin, not a thank you, a scrap of parchment with only 3 words. Hastily written. They fit, somehow. That night, Etta laid her own shoes by the door, not because she expected them to walk away, but because she wanted them to know they were welcome to try. Part 29. The shoe that waited to be chosen. By the 29th night, Penlow had begun to accept the presence of impossible shoes the way it accepted the rising mist or the scent of wet leaves. Curious, but not questioned. People walked more slowly across the square now, casting second glances at doorsteps, at benches, at their own shadows, just in case something had arrived. And on that night, Etta noticed something she hadn't seen before. A single shoe, just one, resting on the shoemaker's bench. No pair, no mate, no note. It was delicate, velvet, midnight blue, with a heel low enough to speak of quiet dignity. The stitching was like thread pulled from candle smoke. Along the side was a simple swirl, embroidered in a soft, pearlescent gray. Not a signature, a suggestion. Etta watched the shoemaker emerge from the granary and pause when he saw it. He did not place it there, but he recognized it. He sat before it, waited, touched nothing, and after a few minutes, he did something she had never seen before. He opened his satchel, took out 12 different insoles, all slightly different in size, shape, material. One by one, he gently pressed each insole against the single shoe. Each time, he shook his head. Too wide, too soft, too unfamiliar. Until the 9th insole. That one, he didn't press. He simply held it near the shoe. And the shoe leaned. Etta blinked. It was unmistakable. The shoe leaned into the insole, as if pulled by memory. The shoemaker smiled, not out of satisfaction, but like someone finding a long-lost letter in a book they'd forgotten they loved. He placed the insole in, tapped the toe twice, then stopped, and left the shoe exactly as it was. Unworn, unboxed, just waiting. Etta didn't understand, until just before dawn, when a woman, unfamiliar to Penlo, wearing a traveling cloak and carrying nothing but a bundle of bread and twine, stepped into the square. She moved slowly, with the weariness of someone who hadn't rested in months. She saw the shoe, paused, bent down, and slipped her foot into it. It fit. She stood straighter, smiled without surprise, and whispered, just once, into the lantern's light, "I was ready now." She walked away barefoot on the other foot, the unmatched shoe still tied to her pack. The shoemaker didn't appear again that night, but the bench gleamed with dew that didn't touch anything else, like the air around it had warmed briefly. Only for her. Etta, wide awake now, wrote a single line into the margin of her old journal. Some shoes are made for people who aren't quite ready, until the moment they are. Part 30. The door behind the bench. By the 30th night, the stories in Penlo no longer needed telling. They breathed in the walls, curled into the corners of chimneys, echoed in the footfalls of people walking slightly slower, listening slightly more. It wasn't that the villagers understood the shoemaker, they didn't. Not fully, but they'd stopped trying to explain him. Some mysteries don't ask to be solved. They only ask to be seen. And on that final night of the turning month, Etta noticed something new, not left on the bench, but behind it, a door. Small, square, not part of the granary wall, not visible the night before. It was made of the same old timber as the granary itself. But its hinges were copper, clean, silent, newly used. There was no handle, no knocker, just a circular symbol carved into its center, a shoemaker's last, crossed with a spiral of thread. Etta didn't blink, didn't breathe, for a moment, because when the shoemaker arrived that night, later than usual, slower in step, he did not sit at the bench. He stood before the door. And he waited. One by one, the shoes began to arrive. Not from people, from the village itself. Shoes came walking, gently, steadily, from thresholds, closets, rafters, barns, some old, some polished, some still muddy from memory. They moved not as if guided by magic, but by completion, like each had finished its part in the story and knew where to go. They lined up quietly before the door. Dozens, then hundreds. Etta opened her door and stepped into the square. No one else came. This moment, it seemed, was meant only for her. The shoemaker glanced at her, and nodded once. He opened the door, and inside was not a room. It was a path, stone, sloping gently downward into soft golden light. Not firelight, not daylight, something older. The shoemaker stepped aside. The shoes entered, one by one, pairs reunited, odd ones finding their match. Some paused at the threshold, as if in goodbye, then disappeared into the light. When the last shoe had passed through, the shoemaker turned to Etta. In his hands, the slippers he had made for her, and the key that had once rested inside. He offered them again, and said, softly, "You may walk this path someday. If you choose. The shoes will wait. The light knows your name." He stepped through the door, and did not return. The door closed silently, and disappeared, not into the air, into the memory of the square. And now, sometimes, Etta walks past the spot where the bench once stood, and pauses, and hears, faintly beneath her feet, the soft sound of footsteps. Not lost, not forgotten, just continuing. Part 31. The shoebox that wasn't empty. After the door disappeared, the square in Penlo felt different. Not emptier, not sadder, just quieter, as though it were catching its breath. The shoemaker's bench was gone. The lantern never lit again. The tools, the thread, the polished box of misfit soles, all had vanished like morning mist. And yet, Etta never thought of it as absence. She thought of it as a room just down the hall, the kind you hadn't stepped into yet, but still felt connected to. Days passed, then a week, then a soft knock, not on her door, but from beneath it. She opened it to find a shoebox. Old, dusty, the kind one might keep tucked away for years, beneath a bed or behind a bookshelf. It had no label, no address, no weight, but when she lifted the lid, slowly, carefully, what she found was not shoes. Not yet. It was possibility. Empty in the way a stage is empty before a play begins. Inside was a folded piece of parchment. No handwriting, only embossed lines in faint silver. For you to fill. Beneath the parchment, Nestled in soft blue cloth were two perfectly shaped souls. Not finished, uncut, unstitched, just ready. Etta's hands trembled. The message wasn't asking her to walk. It was asking her to make. Not shoes, necessarily, but a next step, a new rhythm, a quiet inheritance. That night, she opened the drawer where she had stored old scraps of fabric. Bits of embroidery, ribbon ends she never threw away. She laid out her teacup, her thimble, her notebook. She sharpened a pencil and drew the faint outline of something, not a slipper, not a boot, something not yet named. The shoebox sat quietly beside her, waiting, and in the candlelight, the reflection in her window showed not just herself, but a bench, and a faint, familiar glow just over her shoulder. Part 32. The stitch that couldn't be seen, but was felt. Etta hadn't threaded a needle in years. Not because her hands were stiff, they weren't, but because, until now, nothing had asked her to. Not properly, not deeply, not in the way that leaves your fingertips tingling long after the thread has passed through. But the souls in the shoebox weren't quiet. They watched her, in a way that wasn't unkind, just patient. So she tried. The first stitch was crooked. The second pulled too tightly. The third broke the thread. She laughed once, softly, the way someone laughs at an old memory they just remembered belongs to them. She tried again, and again, not to succeed, but to listen, because somewhere between the 12th and 13th stitch, she felt something, a tug, not on the thread, on her heart, like something invisible had joined her, sitting beside her, guiding gently, not correcting, not speaking, not seen, just felt. A hand over hers, a breath near her shoulder. And then, as if passed through without motion, the next stitch pulled perfectly. Not visible, not measured, but true. She paused, looked. There was nothing in the light. No figure, no shadow, no shoemaker. But the stitch was there. Not in the fabric, in the space between it. The kind of stitch that doesn't hold things together in the way a seam does, but in the way a promise does. When she moved to the next thread, her hand didn't tremble. The cloth bent more easily. The sole curved without resistance. And though the shoe was still unformed, Etta could feel it beginning. Becoming a shoe, yes, but also a step. A story. She worked long into the night. Candle burning low, eyes not tired but full, as if the act of stitching was not about completion, but connection. Before she slept, she wrote a single line on the parchment the shoemaker had left behind. "I felt you here." That was enough. And tucked it back into the box. In the morning, she found a second stitch, one she didn't remember making, tied neatly in golden thread, and looping into the shape of a spiral, like the beginning of something that didn't want to end. Part 33. The thread that led nowhere, and everywhere. By the 33rd night, Etta's fingers had begun to understand without asking. She no longer measured the distance between stitches. She no longer double-checked her knots. Her hands simply moved, guided by something that didn't come from muscle or memory, but from something quieter, something that had been waiting. Waiting to be used, waiting to be trusted. And so she worked, not by pattern, but by feel. And one night, as she reached for a spool of pale thread, soft blue, the color of early dusk, she noticed something unusual. A single strand had unspooled from it, and trailed across her floor. Not far, just a few feet, but far enough to catch her attention. She followed it, across the rug, past the teapot, toward the hearth, where it disappeared, into the wall. At first, she thought it was just caught, some snag in the wood grain. But when she gently pulled the thread, it didn't resist. It led, not with force, but with invitation. She followed, out the door, into the square, across the cobbles she had crossed so many times that her feet might have memorized them better than she had. The thread wound through the edge of the granary, across where the bench had once stood, and curved toward the elm, the one where the child's slipper had once been laid. And there, tied around the lowest branch, was a knot, a perfect loop, and tucked into that loop, a folded piece of parchment, soft from dew, but still readable. Etta opened it slowly. The message wasn't signed, but she knew the hand. Some threads don't bind, some threads don't end, some threads only show you the way. She smiled, not with surprise, but with knowing, then untied the knot, and let the thread fall. It didn't unravel. It simply vanished. as if it had gone as far as it needed to. That night, she returned to her stitching, and realized the shoe she had been making didn't look like her own. Didn't match anything she would wear. It was softer, wider at the toe, and shaped slightly to the right, the way a certain man's steps had always leaned when walking under a heavy satchel. She placed her hand on the shoe, closed her eyes, and whispered, "If you find your way back, these will be waiting." Part 34. The last shoe that wasn't the end. The 34th night arrived with rain. Not a storm, not thunder, just a long, quiet weeping from the sky, the kind that soaked the thatch, made the cobbles shine, and drew out the scent of everything the earth had tried to forget. Etta didn't light her candle. She didn't need to. The rain was enough light, enough sound. She sat by the window, slippered feet tucked beneath her, the shoebox open on her lap. Inside, the shoe she had nearly finished, soft gray wool, lined with elder bark and stitched along the heel with thread the color of worn parchment. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and also, not hers. Because this shoe wasn't made for her feet. It was made for her story. The shape of the arch held every pause she'd ever taken at a crossroad. The toe curled ever so slightly in the way her voice did when remembering something she never said aloud. The heel bore the weight of questions, not heavy ones. Just the kind that keep you leaning slightly backward when stepping forward. She set the shoe on the sill. Not outside, just near, as if offering it to the air. The rain did not touch it. She waited, and waited, until just past midnight, when she finally rose and crossed the room, not because of a sound. Not because of a shadow. Because of a pull. At her front door, resting in silence, was a second shoe. Not left, not delivered, just there. It matched hers in no visible way, a different color, a different stitch. The toe was broader, the heel taller. It had clearly been made by another hand. But it belonged to her shoe, to her story. She placed them side by side. They didn't fit together, but they understood each other. And that was enough. She didn't try to wear them. She didn't bind them with laces. She simply wrapped them in the cloth the shoemaker had once left for her, the ivory one, with the faint embroidery of a spiral at the edge. Then she whispered, "This is the last shoe." But as she spoke, she felt something stir. Not in the room, in the cloth. The shoes were warming, not glowing, not humming, just warming, gently, the way hands do when they've been held too long and cold. And she knew then, this wasn't the end, just the end of these. That somewhere, a new box was opening, a new thread unspooling, a new stitch waiting to be pulled. She left the wrapped shoes on the bench beside her window. And when she woke the next morning, they were gone, but beneath the cloth lay a small, hand-carved button made of rosewood. It bore no symbol, only a faint, quiet grain, like a fingerprint from someone who had once known how to make shoes without needing to measure. Part 35. The shoemaker's footsteps in the dust. The 35th night arrived without ceremony. No fog, no wind, no whispers in the floorboards. The square in Penlow was simply quiet, not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet of completion. Etta didn't sit by the window. She stood at the door. She didn't carry her candle. She didn't bring tea, just a small rosewood button in her hand. Its grain smooth and familiar, the kind of texture your thumb comes to know after enough time spent thinking without words. She crossed the square in her old slippers, the ones he hadn't made, but had watched her wear so many nights ago. The cobbles felt soft beneath her steps, though they hadn't changed. It was she who had. When she reached the place where the bench had once been, she didn't stop. She kept walking, toward the granary, past the tree, to the place where the shoes had once vanished through a door carved of time and silence. And there, she saw them, footprints, not new, not old, just present, left in dust that hadn't been there before. Wide at the heel, soft at the toe, the shoemaker's. She followed them, across the stones, through the edge of the square, down a path not marked by road, but by knowing. They didn't lead far, only to the edge of a thicket where wild thyme grew and bees slept curled into petals. There, on a stone, rested a folded cloth, ivory, embroidered with a spiral, and inside, a single pair of shoes. Finished, not for walking, not for wearing, for leaving. They weren't hers, but they were meant for her. She knelt, pressed her fingers to the toe. They were warm, and beside them, etched faintly into the stone. 5 words. It's your bench now, Etta. She laughed softly, cried even more softly, carried the shoes home. The next morning, when the village woke, they found her bench already there. Simple, sturdy, facing not the road, but everything else. And every evening, a lantern lit, not from flame, from memory. Because stories, like shoes, are never truly finished. They're just passed along, to someone kind enough to keep stitching.